Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of Dispatches. I'm your host, Brady Kreitzer. Our guest today is Frank Rausch, and he'll be discussing about a battle in 1775 you probably don't have in mind as the battle you're thinking about, the battle and siege of Savage's Old Fields. Frank, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Frank, we did an episode on South Carolina last week and the work they're doing on the 250th, so we're going to continue with our South Carolina conversations this week. Tell us a little bit about yourself. You're a first-time guest.
Sure. So, first-time guest, long-time listener, but I'm originally from small-town Indiana, and I was curious, therefore, about places outside the United States. I mean, I liked American history, but I was especially curious about the rest of the world. So I ended up going and getting a PhD studying Korean history, and then I was hired at Lander University to teach world history. So it's kind of funny. You write a dissertation on a very, very narrow focus. Mine was on 19th and early 20th century Catholicism and Korean violence, which is about as specialized as you can get. And then I had to teach the whole history of the world. When I was to teach classes in Asian history, East Asian popular culture, including comics and anime and religious history. And then also I teach courses in public history as well.
Okay, Frank, tell us what made you interested in this particular topic? Why did you want to write this article?
So it's kind of funny as I was thinking about these questions. My background, what I teach, doesn't make it necessarily think about teaching about the American Revolution. But one thing, because I study East Asian history, I think a lot about authoritarian forms of government. Right. I teach about North Korea, talk about the People's Republic of China. And so I often wonder, well, how did we get going in a very different direction? Right, with the idea of checks and balances and individual rights and things like that, and so that's a part of that connection. When I was in high school, though, like I said, I always also enjoyed American history. I was just curious about the rest of the world too, and so when I was in high school, I reenacted and did living history with the 19th Indiana, so American Civil War, and Lander University, where I teach, is very close to 96. And Ranger Adrian Stewart of the National Park Service there had put out a call for volunteers to our department asking, does anyone want to serve on the swivel gun crew? And of course, the opportunity to fire a small cannon and get a count on my annual review, right? Because that counts as community service and service to the profession and so forth. I mean, that's great. So of course I immediately said, yes, please sign me up. And I remember, as I was learning the history of 96, there's a living historian there named Rick Morris, and I was listening to him give a talk. And he mentioned that, in this battle, very few people were injured or killed. We know of one. There's probably around over 2,000 people fought. There's one killed on the Whig side, and then a few more killed on the Loyalist side, and that's it. And the battle lasts like 3 days. It's like, that's really strange to have such low casualties. And I was like, yeah, that is strange. And he said, he didn't think people's hearts were in it. And I was like, yeah, that sounds right. And I wanted to dig deeper to try and get a sense, give a little bit of substance to what I think was a very good argument. And the other thing was just that, and I don't know if this is because I'm a specialist in Korea, but I like thinking about anniversaries. And Dr. Marvin Can of Lander University, who I never knew, but was a predecessor of mine, he published an article in 1975 on the battle. And I was like, okay, I got to do that. Maybe this will work, and I can do something on the 250th and keep this trend alive. And then hopefully we'll have someone 275 and 300th as well.
Serendipitous for sure. Okay, Frank. So I'm going to give you a big question that hopefully we can make small for the episode, but don't hold anything back. Tell us, what's going on in South Carolina in 1775? What are the politics of that place? Because it's pretty wicked.
Right. Yeah. I think that to keep it as simple as possible, one word would be divided, and another word would maybe be geographically divided. So you have among the coastal elites, the people in the Low Country, there is a definite tendency towards supporting the Whigs, supporting what would later be called the Patriot side, and kind of questioning the authority of the king. But again, they're not always necessarily open about that, of challenging the king directly. Sometimes they're also trying to say, hey, we're still loyal, even though they're forcing the South Carolina governor on to evacuate and get on a ship, and setting up a provincial government. In the backcountry, that's where we're going to see a little bit more, quite a bit of loyalism. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but two big ones. One was just a lot of the people in the backcountry were fairly recent immigrants who had been given land by the king, like some folks from Germany. And wouldn't make sense for them to then challenge the king right after he just gave them land. Another thing was that throughout the 1760s, there was a struggle because the backcountry wanted courts and jails and other things like that. They wanted government infrastructure, and the folks in Charleston didn't want to share power. They preferred to have one system of courts in Charleston, forcing people in the backcountry then to go all the way down, ride of several days in order to get to Charleston to do their judicial business. And by the early 1770s, they did get a courthouse, they did get a jail in 96 and in some other districts. But the key thing was there was always this kind of understanding among many backcountry folks that the king was the check against the elite in Charleston and in the Low Country. And if something happened to the king, the elite could just do whatever they wanted. And so that was something that created a geographical divide. One reason why there was a lot of loyalism in the backcountry.
Yeah, Frank, you in your article, to kind of get the ball rolling, you choose to talk about the seizure of Fort Charlotte as one of these real kind of turning point moments in the backcountry. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so Fort Charlotte was a strategic fort, so something you want to get a hold of. And it had supplies. If I recall correctly, it had swivel guns, but also had a lot of gunpowder. And one thing was that South Carolina did not have enough gunpowder. Neither side felt they had enough, so they wanted more. And so the Provincial Congress, which of course would be the side on the Whig government, they wanted to seize it. And so they go ahead and they take the fort. And one thing that I think is important to my overall argument is that there's really no fighting. So it's a battle with no fighting, if that makes sense. There's combatants. They come in and say, hey, we want the fort. And the people there say, okay. So and that's one reason when I talk about the siege of Savage's Old Fields, I don't call it the first battle. I say it's the first battle where there's casualties. So that's one thing about it. The other thing about it is it really shows how it's confusing who's on what side. So one of the militia leaders who helped seize Fort Charlotte for the Provincial Congress is a man named Moses Kirkland. He's actually a loyalist. And when he can, after he leaves the Fort Charlotte for 96 with the officer who was in charge of taking Fort Charlotte, he then manages to, with the help of some other loyalists, arrest that officer and throw him in jail in 96. He's there for about a day and they bail him out. And so it's just like, wait, what's going on? Like, you get the side that people are still trying to figure out what side they're on. And there's lines that they don't really want to cross, right? No one's killing each other. They're not even imprisoning each other for a long period of time. They really don't seem to want to hurt each other yet.
Yeah, Frank, in your article, you do a great job of giving us a cast of characters. I chose Robert Cunningham here for the interview just to give viewers a little bit of an insight into what's happening. Of course, reading your articles is the best way to do that. Tell us who is Cunningham? Why did you hone in on him?
Sure. Well, he is one of the reasons why he's an example of another line being crossed that's eventually going to lead to the actual killing. He was a loyalist who really just wanted to be left alone. And that was what many loyalists' attitude was that they just wanted to be left alone. But what would happen was another loyalist leader, a man named Thomas Fletchell, had signed a peace treaty with the representatives of the Provincial Congress. And Robert Cunningham did not like that peace treaty and did not accept it. And one reason was that he claimed that Fletchell was drunk and or scared, and he had signed under duress, and therefore he didn't accept it. But the other problem was the peace treaty was very lopsided. To give just two examples, the Loyalists pledged that if British soldiers showed up, they would not help them. They also said that they would recognize the Provincial Congress as a legitimate government. And that doesn't make any sense for a loyalist to do, right? The loyalist should recognize the royal governor as a legitimate government, not the ones that drove him out of the colony, or at least off the mainland. So Cunningham says, I will not accept this. And Drayton, a man named William Henry Drayton, who's in charge of kind of suppressing loyalist sentiment in the backcountry and getting people to sign on to what's called the Association, which just is like a document that says we accept the Provincial Congress. He writes Robert Cunningham a letter and says, is this true? Do you reject the treaty? And Cunningham writes back a letter and says, I do. So Drayton then goes and arrests Cunningham, and he's taken to Charleston and thrown in jail. And then Drayton says, well, that's good. I took care of the loyalists, right? We got this treaty of Fletchel. I just punished Cunningham. No one's going to mess with us. So now I need to think about what we're going to do about the Cherokee. We want them to at least be neutral, and Drayton will arrange for a lot of gunpowder and lead to be sent to the Cherokee. Now, what Robert Cunningham didn't count on was what Drayton did not count on was Robert Cunningham's brother, Patrick Cunningham, who was also a loyalist and was not very happy that his fellow loyalist and brother had been put in jail. And this, again, I think was kind of a crossing of the line. So on October 31st, he, with a group of soldiers, or I guess you'd say militia, captured a wagon train delivering gunpowder and lead to the Cherokee. And then he will take that. And what I think is interesting is, again, you've got a bunch of guys with guns. You've got a very valuable cargo. There's no casualties. No one's killed. No one's even wounded. And what I think is really amazing is that Cunningham lets everyone go. They don't imprison them, right? If they wanted to really cause trouble, they could have just, took the people with them, and that would have given them a little bit more time. They wouldn't be able to report anything, but he just lets them go. And again, it seems like there's this tendency, there's some lines we don't want to cross. But what's really important about this especially is then the provincial Congress is going to send out forces to arrest Patrick Cunningham and to try and other loyalist leaders and to put down the loyalists who are embodying, right? They're actually assembling. So this is how we get forces to actually start moving that leads to the battle. And that's why Robert Cunningham's such an important person, even though he spends most of our time in jail.
Okay, Frank, so I'm a battlefield nut. I'm a geography wonk. I need to know this. Tell us, what was Savage's Old Fields? What does it look like? Why is it valuable? Why do forces end up there?
So it's a nice thing because it's a very good description of what it is. There was a guy named Savage's, and he had fields there that were just outside of 96. And of course, 96 is a very strategic location. There was a town there. They had a brick jail there, which of course, it being made of brick, it was impervious to musket fire. And there were very few brick buildings in the backcountry. So that's one thing that made it very important area that you would want to go to. The reason that and what happens is the Whigs, they learn that there's loyalists around, and these are the Whigs under Williamson, and they also know that they're outnumbered. They have about 600 people. The loyalists have maybe like 1,800 or so. So the Whigs are outnumbered about 3-1. So they need a strong defensive position. And so in the middle of these fields are a bunch of outbuildings. So like it's probably like 4, but it seems like a barn and several other smaller buildings. And they realize they can fortify this by just taking a whole bunch of fence rails and connecting the different outbuildings. And they use cowhides and bales of straw to fortify it. And they also, because it's fields, they're clear. And one advantage the Whigs had, even though they didn't have the numbers, was they had 4 swivel guns. And so now they've got a nice fortification surrounded by relatively clear fields of fire for their rifles and their swivel guns. So that's why they chose to go there.
Okay, Frank, so I think we did enough of background. Take us through the battle, the siege of Savage's Old Fields.
Okay, yeah. So what happened was on the morning of November 19th, the Whigs got there first to this strategic location. And as I was describing before, they start to fortify the area. They've got about 3 hours to get everything ready. And then the Loyalists come in, and it's really interesting because the Loyalists come in beating drums and flying flags. And I wish they told us what flag they were flying. It would be interesting to know. Maybe it was just a regular British flag. But they come in. And again, what's interesting is that this battle is going to last from the morning of November 19th to the evening of November 21st. So it's fairly long. But they don't start shooting each other. Again, there's an attempt to just say, okay, let's figure out a way to deal with this. Now the Loyalists have the advantage. So when they parley, the Loyalists say to the Whigs, look, you guys need to surrender and give us all your guns, and then we'll let you go. And the Whigs don't want to do that. They know that they have reinforcements coming. They know that they have a strong position, so they say no. And then the Loyalists say, well, don't leave your fort. And it's not clear how quickly this happened. I get the sense it almost happened almost immediately after the parley breaks down. But the Loyalists grab 2 Whigs from outside that are outside the fort, and then shooting starts. The Whigs fire at them, the Loyalists fire back. And then from about, like I said, that goes on until the evening of November 21st. And it's kind of a weird battle because it's really a stalemate in a large sense, because the Whigs, they're not going to come out. They're outnumbered 3-1, and they got a good position. So they do not want to come out. The Loyalists, they really need to do something because they know that Whig reinforcements are coming. So they got to do something, but they don't really have the training to launch a frontal assault against a fortified area with swivel guns and rifles across a clear field. That's not how backcountry warfare works, right? It's a war of posts. It's when fighting with the Native Americans, you stay in your fort, you don't leave it, or you launch raids occasionally, but you're not going to launch a frontal assault. So they don't have the training to do that, and I don't think they would really want to do it anyway. They're not going to have the inclination either. So far, we've seen they haven't really been that interested in killing each other, and they certainly aren't interested in dying. And especially, again, it's not quite clear what's being fought for. It's not clear what's going on, right? We haven't declared independence yet. People just aren't quite sure what is happening. And so that's their kind of situation. So what they try and do is they have a couple stratagems that the Loyalists use. One thing to do is they try and set fire to the grass and to the remaining crops in the field. And the problem is it's too wet, and so it doesn't burn. And their goal was just to create a smoke screen that they could attack behind. I'm not sure how useful that would be against the swivel guns, but that was their idea, but it didn't work. Their other plan was they tried to build what's been called a rolling battery or a mantelet, but basically they tried to build like a wooden shield that they could move forward and move behind and use that to stage an assault. That failed pretty quickly, and they ended up destroying it themselves. So the problem was they just didn't know what to do other than just snipe at each other. And just, this is in the article, but I worked with some of my students in the Experiencing History Lab. We used a set of miniature wargaming rules called the Live Free or Die, put out by Little Wars, where we actually gamed out what would have happened if the Loyalists had launched a frontal assault, and it really would have been a bad idea. They would have been driven back with large amounts of casualties. And we did a couple what if scenarios where one was, what if they had British soldiers? That probably also would have fit, or that would have succeeded, but with massive casualties. So it would have been like a Bunker Hill situation. I think they needed 3-pounders, which were not in the backcountry this time.
Frank, you said it yourself. This is a weird event. It's not really like any battle we've seen, certainly in the Revolution. And by 75, there's really not that many to speak of anyway. What are the consequences of this battle? I mean, it seems like neither side has a good idea of what they were trying to accomplish in the big picture. So now that we know the big picture, why does this event matter?
Well, there's a few things going on. So to kind of wrap up the battle itself, the Whigs, they feel like they're in a really desperate situation because they're low on gunpowder. Remember, we talked about how important that is, and they're low on food. And they were actually preparing a night attack, apparently to set fire to the Loyalist area. But again, I don't know how much that would help because the Loyalists had the brick jail. And I'm not sure what the Whigs were trying to do. If they thought that they could destroy if they thought they could defeat the Loyalists, or if they just wanted to create diversions so they could then retreat. But before they could do that, the Loyalists said, hey, let's parley. And this was good for the Whigs. We're not sure about the Loyalists. And one problem with studying this battle, we don't have any Loyalist accounts. So we're not sure what was going on. My guess is it was a similar thing. They were running low on ammunition and food, and they also knew that if they didn't resolve something soon, a bigger Whig force was going to come in, and that was going to cause problems. So they do negotiate, and basically they come to an agreement to just take a timeout. That's pretty much the agreement. They're going to wait for instructions. But what happens then is that while the parley is going on, if they're in like a house, several hundred Loyalists apparently surround them and say, we want the swivel guns. You got to give us the swivel guns. And this is a very scary situation from the Whig perspective because their leaders are surrounded by a bunch of Loyalists. And the Loyalists could have said, you know what? You arrested Robert Cunningham. We're arresting you. But they don't do that, right? They just say, we want the swivel guns. And so they put that in the agreement. Okay, we'll give the swivel guns. But the Loyalist leaders made a oral promise, we'll return you the swivel guns in 3 days. And what I think is astounding is they keep the promise. The Loyalists are able to parade around with the swivel guns, say, look, we got the swivel guns, and then they give them back in 3 days. And I think it's just really, really striking when we think about this, right? Because like where we said, there's probably one Whig who dies and a few Loyalists who die. We've got this kind of gentlemanly agreement at the end. And so it tells us something about how there's just not that bloodthirsty spirit yet in the South, right, during this war, that they're just not that interested, that many of them do want peace and don't want to fight.
Frank, how does this fit into the larger picture of South Carolina and the Revolution? Because, as you just mentioned, it's not the war we all know yet. The Swamp Fox and all of these sort of figures, that's not there yet. So how do you think this siege fits into that bigger story?
So in terms of the media event, unfortunately, what happens is very quickly we can see that gentlemanly spirit die, because what happens is there's other Whig forces who say, you know what, we're not bound by that treaty. Even though the treaty says it includes everyone, and that's what the Loyalists thought, it includes everyone, this is really going to end. And so that gives the Whigs an advantage. So in the Snow campaign, which continues after November into December or January, the Whigs just have the upper hand. They're better organized. The Loyalists and the Loyalist leaders are kind of scattered and are not ready, and they just get isolated and completely suppressed by the Whig forces. So they're going to be in that kind of condition where there's not much they can do until Charleston is seized by the British forces in May of 1780. So that's kind of the immediate results. In terms of just helping us to understand, what I find in studying Southern history as a transplanted Midwesterner is that sometimes there's a tendency to say, well, there's a lot of violence in Southern history because Southerners are violent, which especially if they're Scots-Irish Southerners. and I don't think that's the best argument, right? It's more complex than that. And that's what this shows us, right? These people started out hesitant to fight. And it's funny because I start the article with that quote from Nathaniel Greene where it just says, this is brutal violence. And this guy's been fighting for years. He says, it's so violent here. But that's not how it started, right? It didn't start that way at all. But it did start off a cycle of violence and of retribution that is going to transform the area, right? So what we see here is how the revolution is creating, unfortunately, this conflict that transforms a relatively peaceful area into a very brutal area where this cycle of violence just makes things worse and worse.
That's profound. I had never thought of it that way. So that's worth the money for sure. Okay, Frank. So speaking of money, here's the $1 million question.
Uh-oh.
We ask it on every episode. How do you think this story, this article, your research helps us understand the Revolutionary era better?
I think a couple things. One is just kind of going back to that point. It just shows us how areas could be transformed by the Revolution, and that we do want to be careful about thinking in a kind of an essentialist way. Well, Southerners are violent. Well, it's more complex than that. That there are these kinds of transformations that happen as you go through it, and we also see how the communities could be transformed, how identity was transformed, right? That these were people who thought themselves, I think, we're South Carolinians who live in the backcountry. And then suddenly they have to think of themselves in new ways. Am I a Whig? Am I a friend of the king? Am I a patriot? Am I a loyalist? What am I? And increasingly, there's no neutral space. You can't go back to that old identity of simply, I'm a backcountry South Carolinian. You got to be something else. And that something else is something that's going to transcend the backcountry. So you're going to develop a feeling towards something bigger than the backcountry or bigger than South Carolina, either the patriot cause or the cause of the king.
Excellent. Well, Frank Rausch, thank you so much for joining us. Everyone, you can find Frank's article, of course, at the Journal of the American Revolution website, www.allthingsliberty.com. Frank, thanks again.
Thank you so much.